episode 64. Hello, thanks for tuning in to this special midweek episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff, and I'll be your host on the show. It's my pleasure to welcome Paul Sinclair back to the show. If you'll remember, Paul was the guest for episode 62. Paul, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for allowing me to come back.
You know, episode 62 that we did about a week and a half or so ago, it was a very popular show. You were kind of pressed for time, and that's understandable because of the time difference. I've been looking forward to bringing you back on because I know there are a lot of other interesting topics that we can talk about.
Excellent. No problem at all, Vic. I'm sorry to say I've not really got any new accounts that I can share with the readers, but in the last interview we did touch on little bits of the history of the area of Flixton and the surrounding areas of East and North Yorkshire. So if you like, Vic, we could talk a little bit tonight about these places and maybe the significance to what we were talking about and what your show's all about.
That sounds really good. Flixton used to be known by a different name, you told me in the pre-interview. What can you tell us about that?
Indeed it did, Vic. I found out, and obviously anyone wanting to do a little bit of research on this can find out, that Flixton used to be known as Wolfland, which is interesting in itself when we're talking about the Flixton Werewolf. Obviously, the East Yorkshire Wolds and the North Yorkshire Moors in ancient times were populated by wolves. I would have thought quite densely populated. The Flixton Star Car, which is the Mesolithic archaeological site, there's lots of artifacts and things being dug up in that area showing that wolves were sort of highly prevalent in the area. But for a place to be called Wolfland sort of adds a little bit more weight to this story, I feel. And there's little sort of links to other areas as well, Vic. When we spoke the other week, we kept touching on the road, the A1039. The last account that I got from the young lady on the island known as Spittle Corner, again the A1039, at the side of it is the old Spittle Farm. That place is the place where in ancient times, going way back into the 10th century, in the reign of King Athelstan, a knight who was then Lord of Flixton built a refuge to protect travellers from wolves, and it says, and infestation of savage beasts, lest they be devoured. These are in ancient writings by a scribe known as Camden. I don't know how far back that writing goes, but Camden wrote about this. What is interesting is, obviously, the refuge was built at Spittle Corner. A lot of writers have said it was built in Flixton. It's actually not Flixton, it's at Saxon. However, going through lots of research in various archives and places, the Bailgate at Bridlington, which was part of the Bridlington Priory, the one at Staxton, the refuge at Staxton, was called St Mary's Spittle, and that was overseen by the Bridlington Priory. But I found out that there was a second one in Flixton. It stood where Flixton House now stands, or once stood. I don't know if Flixton House is still there. And that one was Carman's Spittle. Now, that name is interesting in itself, because just below Flixton we have Flixton Star Car, which is a real sort of interesting place which we've just touched on. It's a Mesolithic site, and it boasts some fabulous artifacts that have been dug up around the area of Stark Car, which would have been a lake in ancient times. It was after the Ice Age and man settled there. So the inhabitants of Stark Car go back like 11,000 years, Vic. Some archaeologists have said that they thought these people were shaman. They found evidence of ritual killings, as in piles and piles of bones and horse butchery. One thing that they found nowhere else other than Starcar, preserved in the mud, is 21 red deer skull caps with aisles shaped into them and holes for straps. And it is thought by archaeologists that the early inhabitants of Starcar were using these in their ritualistic, what would you call it, their performances, working as shamans. They wouldn't have realised that we term them as that now, I know. But it sort of throws a little bit of interest for me on the story of the Flixton Werewolf. if we consider the shamans all around the world that think that they're going to altered states and become the animal of which the skin or the bones they're sort of wearing or working with. So if any of that was true, or if there is an ounce of truth in any of that, it takes the story of the Flixton Werewolf far, far further than the 10th century. We're going back 11,000 years with the people of Starkar. It's actually the found evidence of Britain's oldest house at Starkar, dating back to 9000 BC. So I'm not trying to convince anybody that this is the reason we've got the story of the Flixton Werewolf, but we've got a very, very sort of ancient place with lots and lots of history that can be sort of documented and backed up in the form of these skull caps, in the form of the archaeologists who believe that, well, I won't say all the archaeologists, but certainly archaeologists believe that the inhabitants of Starkar were shaman. So I think it makes for interesting thought anyway when we're considering what the origins of this creature really are.
Just so I'm clear on something, you mentioned Carmen Spittle, I believe.
Yeah, that's correct, Vic. Yeah, the first refuge built to protect travellers from an infestation of savage beasts. I'm sorry to labour on it, but these are the words that are used. The first one is at Spittle Corner at Saxon. This is the one that's been written about by previous authors, I would think. I don't think they will have known about the one in Flixton itself, because it's really took some digging out, and the information I've found has been in archives within the Bailgate and places at Bridlington Priory. Having said that, we've found out that there was a second one in Flixton called Carman's Spittle. Now, I only say it's of interest because there's only a mile apart. If we're going back, I don't know, to 10th century, we've got two refuges built to protect travellers from wolves and these savage beasts within a mile of each other, which is unusual in itself. But that said, it's close to Flixton Starkar, and I'm thinking we've got the inhabitants of Starkar who may have been practicing shamanism. Now, I don't know if there's any truth in shamanism, but certainly cultures all around the world believe that this is real. I've not enough knowledge to say whether it is or it isn't, and there may be people just rolling their eyes as they're listening to this, but I mean, it's been practiced for thousands of years. If there's any truth in this story, well, then we've got Flixton Starkar and the inhabitants of Starkar. Just above the lake, which was Lake Flixton, we have a refuge built called Carman's Spittle. I don't know if there's any link to the name Carman's Spittle. Once again, without being able to actually step back 1,000 years or 2,000 years, we're never going to know. It's only speculation, but nevertheless, I find it highly interesting.
That is really incredible. You mentioned writing there, Paul. You're writing a book. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I'm writing a book that's called The Truth That Leaves No Proof, which it can encompass all of this kind of stuff. I've set off writing everything within a 25 to 30 mile radius of RAF Bempton, close to us, because so many strange things have happened around that area, Vic. Planes crashing between 10 and 25 miles off the head at Flamborough, compass anomalies that the trawlermen tell me about that only occur sort of once in a fisherman's lifetime, all around the same area. I've got recorded testimonies of trawlermen who've recovered bodies from the sea, from these aircraft, and they've been radioactive, the bodies. So I got into all these stories, and the Flixton Werewolf story kept cropping up amongst them, you know, because we took every so often, I mean, 1997, 2006, 1977, there's been spates of big cat sightings, or unusual cat sightings, because they don't seem to conform to what we would consider a big cat to look like, even though we're supposed to have none that live native in the UK. People have said after British Wildlife that these things, I think it was 1976, were released into wild, and I should think that some were. But the life expectancy is probably between 12 and 17 years. Well, we're a lot further down the road than 12 and 17 years from 1976, and these things are still being seen. So, to touch back on Flixton Werewolf, this story kept cropping up. I thought, well, it'll be sort of easy to put away in a few pages. I'm pretty sure that It's just a legend, and there's not a lot to it. But as I got speaking to people and talking to different people around Flixton and Folkton and Caton, all these small villages, people actually knew about it. It took quite a lot of getting out, as I said in the first talk that we did, Vic, but people had actually heard of the Flixton Werewolf and actually had stories to tell, and right up to the accounts of up to present day. So it's grown from what I thought would be a couple of pages into quite a massive bit of writing. In fact, I think you could write a book about it on its own. So that's how we come to the Flixton Werewolf, Vic.
There's a town close to Flixton by the name of Humnby, if I pronounced it right, hopefully, that has in the past been known by a different name with a dog or wolf reference. What can you tell us about that?
I can tell you, Vic, that you've pronounced it right. It's Hunmanby, Hummanby. However, in its ancient past, it was known as Hundmanby. Hundmanby, the reason it was called that was because it was known as the farmstead of the Hound Man. The reasons why it was known as farmstead of the Hound Man possibly could be because the king kept his hounds at Hummanby. That is written, but it could also have other sort of reasons, in that we've got the Flixton Werewolf, or the stories of the Flixton Werewolf, less than 4 miles away. There's Howell Moor at Wolfland, which is 19 miles away. We have obviously Flixton, which was Wolfland. At Wolfland, we have a creature called a Gytrash, which was a huge black dog or goblin horse. Why somebody should describe it as a goblin horse, I really don't know. But I find it interesting that we've got all these references to the dogs and the sort of savage creatures. The goblin horse, I can only think that where you have it, you have bears, you have all sorts of different animals that would compare in size to the things that people are looking at when they view the Dogman. However, we've got nothing in the UK, really. We've got deer, I suppose, and we've got ponies. So I'm wondering, when people are seeing such a surreal thing, quite savage looking, that's why they're referring it to something like a goblin horse. But it comes up as a huge black dog as well, and that, as I say, is at Wolfland. At Wolfland we do have Howell Moor. So that's just sort of two places quite close with references to dogs and hounds that sort of don't fit the norm.
Well, where there's smoke, there's normally fire. I'd say since all these villages in that area have dog or wolf references, maybe there was something going on back then that led all these people to name these villages that way.
That's correct, Vic. Yeah, I mean, once again up in Wolfland, one thing I'd not touched on, we've got Howling Dyke as well. And we've got Hundman Dykes up at Forden. Now, I've never touched on Forden in the talks, but Forden's at the top of Saxon Wold, just over the top, half a mile away. That's a place where the big cats have been seen quite often. So it was only when looking at Hummanby and finding out Hundman, as in Houndman, that when I looked at an old map and saw Hund Dykes at Forden, I realised what they were referring to, and it's Hound Dykes. It's spelt the same. I've been told there is a burial mound, although I haven't been able to find it on any map. I've been told by an old chap who's a bit of an historian, called Wolf Howe, up around Staxton, but I've not got anything sort of on paper to verify that at the moment, Vic.
With regards to the refuges you talked about, you said that they were constructed allegedly to protect travelers from savage beasts as one of the threats. Was there ever a mention of what type of savage beasts they were trying to protect these travelers from?
No mention, Vic. And what's interesting is it says for protection from wolves and an infestation of savage beasts. So it's something other than a standard wolf, I would have thought, or maybe I'm reading too much into it.
It sure does make you wonder. I can't help but notice that they described it as being an infestation. So we're not talking about just one or two scattered about. There must have been quite a few of these things, whatever it is that they're talking about.
That's correct. And there was one other thing that's just come into my mind. When we were talking about Flixton Star Car, the Mesolithic site where the early men lived 11,000 years ago, I think it's Camden again that writes that the wolves of Star Car used to cause carnage when they descended or came out because they preferred the blood of the animal to the flesh of the animal. Now, not being a hunting man and not knowing much about wolves, if I'm being truthful, I don't know whether that's the norm, Vic. I mean, I would have thought they'd have preferred the flesh, but this is sort of ancient writings by a scribe called Camden, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But why he should say that, I don't know. As I say, it is an ancient bit of writing. I don't even know where I've got it now to sort of read the exact text to you, but I do have it.
A lot of these things are very hard to figure. All this talk about wolves and strange behavior brings up another question for you. You told me that the Saxons had a unique name for January. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Saxons called January Wolf Month, and it meant the month that you were most likely to be devoured, eaten by wolves, the leanest month of the year. So they called it Wolf Month, which is sort of quite frightening, really, isn't it?
That is a scary thought. That does make sense, though, that they would call it that. If you think about it, January, there really aren't going to be very many resources for wolves to feed on, so if you have slow walking travelers out there in the woods with no really effective means of protection, I can understand how that would be a big problem.
Well, they would be fair game, I would think, Vic, wouldn't they,
Yeah, that wouldn't be a good situation. Speaking of the Saxons, you also told me that they were out to catch a man who had an interesting name that they had given him. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. There's an old book that's been written in 1605. I'm not sure of the surname. I'm going to pronounce it, but it's probably going to be wrong, and I think it's Richard Vesturgens. If I'm wrong with the surname, then listeners, I do apologise. The book is called A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence, and it sort of chronicles the Saxons and their sort of lifestyle, and he talks quite a bit about wolves and werewolves. He recites, again, I think he's reciting what Camden earlier wrote. They were hunting a man called Goodwin. They put a price on his head. They called him Wolfhead. Now, I don't know whether they called Goodwin Wolfhead because he took on the form of a wolf, or whether that's the terminology that they used for someone who was being hunted, for want of a better word. But Goodwin was called Wolfhead, and that can be found in this ancient book called A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence. And if I'd have had more time, Vic, I would have talked more about what the book says about the werewolves in the book, because it really sort of was interesting. Werewolf sounds like it originates from Germany. You probably already know that, Vic. I don't know whether you do, but from what I've read in this book, it does. In France, they called it the loup-garou. Is any of this familiar to you, Vic?
It is familiar. We do have our own loup-garou references here down south in the Louisiana area.
That is interesting, Vic, yeah, because this book, 1605, Restitution of Decayed Intelligence, it says in Germany they were called werewolf, in France, loup-garou. So these names for similar creatures, they go back hundreds and hundreds of years.
It sure seems like there must be something to it. You told me you think the moon might have connections to sightings of dogmen. What can you tell us about these theories you have?
I don't want anybody to think that I'm imagining that these things are changing at the sight of a full moon as depicted in a Hollywood film or a horror film, because that is not what I think. It's just that doing research into the book and living close to the North Sea, I've been checking tide times for the strange things that have happened. There's missing people at Bempton. 12 have gone since 2004, just vanished. Please don't think I'm connecting them to this, because I'm not trying to, but it tied in with the moon, and I noted that these missing people, the bulk of them had gone on a waning gibbous moon. However, the creature that was seen at Danes Dyke at Flamborough was seen on a blood moon. There's probably no connection, it's probably pure coincidence. The one that was seen a few months ago, the last one, it was seen on a blue moon. Now, I'm quite happy for people to correct me if I've got my information about the moon wrong, but I believe a blue moon is when there's two full moons in the same month, hence you say once in a blue moon. So I was just wondering if there is any connection to the moon. once again, don't ask me why. As I previously stated, if you've looked at everything and you've searched all logical answers, then you've got to start looking at illogical answers. Because if you can't find truth in the logical stuff, it's got to be there somewhere, or some grains of it are.
You must be a fan of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Not really, no.
Yeah, that's a phrase he coined.
Really?
It sure is, with Sherlock Holmes and everything. Talking about all these strange anomalies associated with the Flixton Werewolf or Dogman, you noticed something strange about ley lines in the area and how they connect to these sightings. What can you tell us about that?
Well, top of Flixton Wold, you've got R.F. Staxton Wold. Now, that was originally a Roman hill fort going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Just behind Staxton Wold, you have the barrow cemetery that we talked about in the last one of Sharp How. Now, Sharp How is where the chap who's an old man now saw with his friend the creature squatted down against a tree on its haunches. I'm no expert on ley lines, but I've done a little bit of research on this. In between Sharp How and the Rudston Monolith, which will be about 12 miles away, there's a lot of ley lines said to emanate from the Rudston Monolith. It's the tallest standing stone in Britain, by the way, the Rudston Monolith. Don't ask me to say how tall it is, because I just haven't got that information on top of my head. But there's a burial mound called Willie Howe. It's probably the most famous one in England, so if anybody wants to type it in, it's just Willy and Howe with an E on the end. Now, me and my wife took some dowsing rods and we went round Willie Howe last year, and we found that there's two lines cross in the centre of Willie Howe, and yes, these rods did work. Never used them before. They did turn in, and we put stakes in the ground where they were turning in. We both tried it. We went over the area several times. We spent a full afternoon up there. The centre of the mound, it looks like these lines cross at Willie Howe. Now, there's been no Dogman sightings at Willie Howe, but there's been lots of UFO activity at Willie Howe and big cats. What I find interesting is then if you get an ordnance survey map and you put a ruler on it from Rudston Monolith, because one of the lines runs to Rudston Monolith. From Rudston Monolith, it runs through Willie Howe and up to Flixton Car. Then we've got an area of land at Bempton called the Leys, associated with ley lines. The whole area is scattered with standing stones and ley lines. It seems strange that these areas collect or seem a magnet for strange activity. There's got to be a connection to the ley lines. It's some unseen energy. Like I said to you before, and I don't expect everybody to agree with me, I think there's more to these creatures than pure flesh and blood. Otherwise, I think these expert marksmen and hunters at your side of the world would have brought one down by now. And I'm just not sure if these things aren't interdimensional. Maybe the ley lines have something to do with it. I'm talking without any knowledge, as in scientific knowledge, but who has any knowledge on this? Everything has to start somewhere, and I'm sort of scratching my head and looking at the ley lines, looking at the area, looking at all the burial mounds. They were all put in these locations because of something of great significance. Ancient man were probably more in tune with the spiritual side of things and more open to receiving this kind of thing than we are today. I mean, we're just dumbed down with media and what science tells us is real and what isn't real. We're not open to anything. I mean, they say seeing is believing. I believe that believing is seeing, because I think if you're more open, you're more likely to see these things. Just a theory.
I think you're onto something there. You know, going back to the whole idea about the waning moon and patterns or whatnot, I'm asked from time to time if they only come out when there's a full moon, if the moon seems to have any type of bearing on when you're going to encounter one of these things. And I can tell you that no, that does not seem to be the case. They've been seen when there's been a new moon. In other words, no moon out in the sky. They've been seen under partial moons, full moons, you name it. So there doesn't, on my end, appear to be any rhyme nor reason as to when you're going to encounter one of these things. So please do keep that in mind.
I will do, Vic, and that's well worth knowing. And I don't mind being wrong. As I say, all I'm doing is just kicking ideas around. The biggest one I can't get my head around is how, on the many reports that I've listened to your people recount that they've shot these things and that they have little or no effect on them. And I think sooner or later we have to start asking ourselves, just what is it? I know what my bullets are capable of doing to a creature if I shoot them at this distance or that distance, and it's having no effect. Are we dealing with something that just isn't quite the norm? And another thing, Vic, I've asked two of the people that I spoke to about this Flixton Werewolf, but I'd be interested to know what you think as well. Do you get a male presence? Because they felt it was male. They didn't say they think it was female.
Most people don't report seeing genitalia or getting a feel for whether the dogman they encountered was a male or a female, but that's not to say that all of the eyewitnesses are that way.
I were more leaning towards the actual feeling that the person viewing this horrifying thing gets, if I'm being truthful. I thought about it last time we spoke, and I've since spoken to the lady who saw the thing at Spittle Corner, and although she was in a vehicle travelling, she felt it were male. Not because of what she was looking at, that was the feeling that she got. It was just something that I wanted to ask you last time, and I sort of forgot all about.
Oh, that's all right. I guess if I think about it, the males probably would be more likely to go out and explore and maybe do most of the hunting if they do have a pack type structure, but that is hard to answer. I don't have any good answers for that.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, Vic. And one other point, I'm not sure if we touched on it last time, but side of Spittle Corner, there's running water. Now, is that something that's attributed with these sightings?
Yeah, water is normally nearby.
It's a long way inland, but if we go 69 miles away to a place called Lincolnshire, they have a report of a huge black dog. It's been reported from ancient times. It's been seen, I wouldn't say recently, because I've got no reports of it in the last 4 or 5 years, but I'm concentrating on Flixton, so the reports are probably out there. So it has been seen in the last 10 or 20 years. They call that a shagfoal. And that, unusually, is seen, or has been seen, next to Spittle Hill, which I find unusual in itself, that we've got Spittle Corner at Saxon, and 69 miles away we've got this creature known as the shagfoal, a huge black dog with glowing red eyes that has been seen quite often in an area known as Spittle Hill, where another refuge was built. I don't quite know what the link there is, but we've got a refuge built at Staxton, and we've a refuge built at Lincolnshire, 69 miles away, both with the name Spittle because they're ancient hospitals, but they both have running water at the side of them as well. The running water is built in a location where in ancient times it was convenient. But once again, just a strange coincidence that cropped up. There is, Vic, a few different names for this creature in our country that you might find interesting. We've touched on the guy trash in Wolfland. It is also known as the Barguest in North Yorkshire. Apologies if I'm pronouncing this wrong. In East Anglia, we have the Black Shuck. Once again, huge black dog, flaming red eyes, sort of the patterns forming, isn't it? And then we've got the Capelthwaite in Westmoreland in Cumbria, a similar creature. In the Highlands of Scotland, now this one's slightly different because it's been said to be dark green in colour, so don't ask me how that works, and it's called the Coo-Sith. Coo-Sith. In Suffolk, we have the Black Shuck, or the Gallitrot. In Yorkshire, out of Flixton, because we've got the Flixton Werewolf, but I should imagine it could quite easily be called any of these names, but as a generalisation in Yorkshire, these huge black dogs have been seen, and they're called the Padfoot. In Ireland, they call them the Pooka, P-O-O-K-A. In Lincolnshire, they also call it the Skriker. I should imagine it's just terminology for different areas, but they're all describing the same thing. A huge black dog with glowing red eyes. It's often described as having a shaggy mane to its body, and it's described as being upright, walking on two legs in a lot of the accounts. Another odd one is it's described as a pony. My only reasoning for that, as I've already said, is that we don't have anything as large as this that we can compare it to. In your side of the world, you think, oh, is that a bear? Until you've done some double checking. And maybe when people are seeing things like this, that's why they're relating it to A pony, I don't know. I mean, that's my reasoning with the one on Flixton Werewolf with the guy with the two dogs, and at first he thought it was a small pony. It was only when it got up on two legs and ran down the field that he realised that there's no way it was a pony. So yeah, there's a few names, Vic.
Speaking of the idea that these things have been around in big numbers, widespread, you told me that the farmer recently told you about a pack of some type of creature that is running around the Danes Dyke area. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I can't tell you a lot about this, Vic, but I'm hoping I can give you more information shortly. There's no way that I'm going to give the name of the farmer out, as you would appreciate. But in the last few weeks, there's been a report of a large black cat or dog. They don't actually know what they're looking at. I know there's been at least 4 independent witnesses to this in between 6 and 2 weeks, and it's been seen around Bempton, described as 4 times as big as a dog, as a large dog. Let me just rephrase that, as a large dog. Now, I don't know any large black cat, even to its native country, that's 4 times as big as a large dog. We've got 4 independent witnesses, but as a side note to this, the farmer who shared a little bit of information with me, and I'm very grateful for it, has been speaking to a few other people. And he spoke to the son of another farmer who's now passed away, who lived close to Danes Dyke, and the son said that he always remembers his father being very frightened one night of what he described as a pack of something in Danes Dyke. Now, listeners, my apologies for not being able to offer you any more than that at this moment, because I've not spoken in any detail or depth. It is my hope to speak to the actual son of this chap and get the full story of what he thought the pack of something was in Danes Dyke that frightened him years ago. So it's just a little bit of a teaser of a story, but I will be working on it.
I can't imagine what that man must have gone through if he ran into a pack of these things, if that's what it was that he encountered. That must have been a bad scene. Something that we've talked about at length is your trips out into the field at night looking for these things, Paul. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's not just trips into the field looking for these things, Vic. I've ended up at Flixton Werewolf now and Saxon Werewolf on a night. A few of us have gone up there. Please be aware that we don't run around giggling and laughing and shining torches about like teenagers. I'll go up there and set cameras up. There's been a lot of UFO activity up the top of Saxon Werewolf, which is the RAF base, and we'll observe for hours. But now we've got the added interest of the Flixton story and this alleged beast that is showing up from time to time in this area. Now, I know many people listening will think I'm an absolute fool for going up there at night, and I probably am. I'm not going to try and defend myself and say, oh, I'm brave and I can do this and I can do that. If we do ever encounter this, it might be the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. But we've found ourselves up there on a night, Vic. I mean, and it's a pretty frightening place, especially coming down. I mean, this 45-degree pitch black coming through these wood with probably 4 foot of dense edge and woodland either side of you, coming down this steep path back down from the wold. So I think I know what you're going to say next, Vic, but yeah, probably a bit foolhardy, but we've found ourselves up there.
Well, you're a grown man. You can do whatever you want to do, but yeah, it wouldn't be in my recommendation to do that sort of thing. Although understand, Paul, where I'm coming from, most of the stories that are put out there are pretty innocuous. They end with the eyewitness walking away without a scratch, shaken but not stirred. Having said that, understand, there are stories that are shared with me where that's not how it ended. With that in mind, I look at this whole phenomenon in a different light than a lot of people who have never had access to those sorts of stories. So
I can take all that on board, to be honest, Vic. I think I agree with you. I mean, you're talking to people on a regular basis. I've just hit on this story in a little area in a small part of England and sort of working on that. But you're getting regular input and information about these things on a daily basis, I would think. One thing that does sort of puzzle me, if people can just play with the idea that this thing maybe is interdimensional in nature, then do you think at times the reason it scares people, the reason it stares at people, the reason the bullets have no impact is because it's only like a mirage. Is it actually there in the physical all the time? And another thing that I'm glad you've mentioned this, Vic. People talk about everything going silent, everything being so quiet, and the strange stillness that descends when they're having these sightings. Once again, if anybody who studied the subject of UFOs would know that that is called the Oz factor. People have described seeing UFOs and saying everything went silent around them. It was as though they were in some kind of bubble. They were detached from the world. Now, if that in some kind of altered state of reality, then I don't know what is. And is that what we're encountering when we're having these encounters with these creatures? You know, there's so many factors. Bullets don't seem to have an effect on them. Suddenly everything goes quiet and we're in some kind of altered state. These are what some of your people are actually saying. So when you sort of write these things down and lay them out, you're thinking, well, we're in a different reality here. There's something not quite right. Now, the fear factor, when it tries to frighten people but doesn't do anything more than frighten people, do you think that could be because it can't actually do more than frighten people at certain times? I do know that you've said that there's been times when things haven't gone well, for want of a better word. But a lot of the accounts say how terrifying it is and how it's got such evil intent, but nothing happens. Or the guy at Sharp Howe, when they were boys and it just looked at them and they just did a runner. This thing's more than capable of bringing down anybody, I would have thought, even the most, I don't care who you are, but what we've heard about this thing and the size of it and things, it's more than capable of doing lots of things, yet we've got these altered states of reality that people seem to feel like they're in when they're viewing it. We've got the accounts of shooting at it and nothing happening. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and then we've got other accounts which contradict everything I've said, of it harming people, of it harming livestock. So it really is a difficult one. I mean, one part of me says the interdimensional altered state, is this possible? And then the other part of it sort of throws us back into the reality that this thing is a flesh and blood, living and breathing creature. And I don't know myself. Once again, I'm sorry, listeners, but I'm just kicking ideas out there, hoping it might make people think and hoping somebody might come back with something at me that will sort of help me to look a bit harder at it and make me think differently.
Well, I'm not going to deny that they do a lot of things that are very hard to explain. As far as some of the cases where they've been shot at but weren't killed, in instances like that, I know where they've stepped on twigs and snapped the twigs. That right there would indicate that they are in a here and now type state. If they're able to snap a twig, then you would imagine that that bullet would be able to have full effect on them. That's just something that I can't explain, but in a lot of instances like that, they've done things to indicate that they are in a here and now type state. You're not the first person to mention the possibility of them being interdimensional or having some other kind of a strange quality like that. I don't know how to explain how they do a lot of the things they do, but they sure do some awfully strange things. There's no denying that.
Yeah, I agree, Vic, and that's just thrown me onto something we talked about earlier in this ancient book, Restitution of Decayed Intelligence. This chap writes that it was believed that werewolves were ancient sorcerers, and they wore a girdle of skin, and they anointed their bodies with a cream made and derived from something linked to the devil. When they looked at themselves, they believed that they were werewolves. Anyone looking at them while they were wearing this enchanted girdle with the anointed cream that they put on the bodies on them, anyone looking at them saw a werewolf. Yet they never transformed. It was some kind of mirage, some kind of illusion. Once again, we're jumping miles away from stories of Flixton Werewolf and stories of Dogman at your end of the world, but it's interesting the accounts of the werewolves to sort of throw these in the mix. You know, how ancient people viewed it, and they thought that they were ancient sorcerers. Some early people did. Once again, that writing's in that literature, the Restitution. So quite what truth is in that, I don't know. I mean, some of the things that we can do now would have been looked upon as magic 100 years ago. Some of the strangest things that people say could be true.
Well, that's a good point. It might seem really strange to us that they had those ideas, but I guess it all ties in. Our current views on dogmen, their views on werewolves. it all comes together to talk about the same thing, in my opinion, so I guess it's not my place to discount that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Vic, and probably it's early man's attempt to describe and come up with ideas as to what these things that people are still seeing today. It's just we're coming up with other explanations for them as we've evolved and as we've sort of become more educated. I think ultimately they were seeing the same things back then.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I think you're right. Now, another strange phenomenon with these things that you've already noticed, you even mentioned that in the pre interview. What do you have to say about the tendency of these things to seemingly be seen and then just disappear for a period of time?
I don't understand it at all. Can I just touch on the big cats with this?
Sure.
Because obviously we've got no native big cats here in the UK, yet we do get sightings of them, and these creatures seem to appear and become as real as any big cat seen in its native habitat, but only for a short period of time. 1977, we had a sort of flurry of big cat sightings here in eastern North Yorkshire. 2000, we had them. 2006. I'm not sure. I'm sort of linking back to this interdimensional thing, or linking it to the ley lines. Maybe some kind of energy or portal that allows these things to come through. And I realise that's going to be too much for some people to accept. I mean, when you're out hunting in woods and forests, you don't want to start thinking about portals and energy lines. You just think it's a flesh and blood thing, and I have full respect to anybody. But obviously, these are my views, and I'm not saying I'm right, but at least consider them. And I think the same thing could be happening with these Dogman sightings, to be honest. And I think that's the reason that they're so elusive. I mean, they're sort of here 1 minute, and then there's nothing. Although there again, I've listened to some more of your reports where they're terrorising properties for years and years and years. So I find myself contradicting myself constantly.
You know what? Don't feel bad about that. I can't tell you how many times I've experienced that. Just when you think you've got a bead on something that they do, how they do it, something else happens to just let you know that you don't have a clue about how they do things or certain qualities with regards to them. So, yeah, I feel for you. I've been there, done that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, you'll have heard of the alleged guy who thought he was a werewolf in the 1500s, Peter Stump.
I don't remember his name, but I think I did hear about the story.
I think he was in France, and he was executed in 1589. He believed he transformed and he was a werewolf. He killed 13 children, 2 women, 1 man, and such was the terror that this man instilled in people. They didn't even kill him in a way that, I don't know, he weren't hung or burnt at the stake. They pulled his body parts from his body. I'm sorry for being so graphic. They broke his legs and his arms on wheels. Then they pulled his body apart with hot irons. They believed he was a werewolf. I'm not saying that he was, but this was the sort of terror and fear that this instilled in the people in 1589, when this man sort of actually inflicted his reign of terror.
Yeah, well, back then they had a different way of doing things, that's for sure. After seeing something so scary, I can't blame them for overreacting, which it sure sounds like that's what they did. It's funny how time changes things, Paul. About 10 years ago, from what I understand, you were headlong into UFO research. What would you have told someone then who told you that you'd be looking into the Flixton Werewolf now the way you are?
I'd have probably laughed at him, Vic, if I'm being truthful. Yeah, I really would. I mean, as bizarre as the UFO accounts are, I've had a lifetime of experience with UFOs, and it's a personal experience. It really is. That'd be something to talk about another time, maybe, but we're not talking about UFOs. But the Flixton Werewolf, I mean, where do you start and where do you end? I genuinely just did not think there was anything to it. I just thought it was just an old folk tale that had been handed down and handed down. But I mean, I can tell you now that the last account I got absolutely sealed it for me. I mean, the old guy's account of Flixton Star Car convinced me, but the last account at Spittal Corner just sealed it. This thing I know we're all going to differ on whether it's flesh and blood, whether it's something interdimensional, or whether it's something else altogether. This thing, in whatever shape or form, is real. That's as much as I can say. I'm convinced of it. It's real. And now I'm intrigued. I will dig and I will dig and I will dig. That's the nature of me, and I'll continue to until I've got more answers. I might never get any answers, but it won't stop me looking.
Well, like you said, this thing is real. I don't see how anyone who was in full possession of the facts could deny that. The people that don't accept it as being real are the ones who don't know much at all about it. They've closed their minds off and refuse to even consider the possibilities, so I don't think that could be argued. Having said that, Paul, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Before we get out of here, do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I'd just like anybody listening to just take on board what I've said. Don't take anything as sort of fact. Have a look yourself at what I've told you about as regards the Refuges, Flixton Car, and have a look into it yourself. I mean, it'd be brilliant for other sets of eyes and other minds to look into this ancient story and other ancient stories, because there's probably correlations to lots of stories at your side of the world and in other parts of the world that would help throw light on the Flixton Werewolf, or this story can help throw light on other stories. So I think we should all knock our heads together and actually see what we can sort of solve or try and solve. It's the only way we're going to do it. I mean, me looking into all this at this end of the world, there's only so much I can do. Other brains and other minds need to be looking into it.
Well said. I don't think it can be denied that in order to make any kind of headway on this phenomenon, it's going to be a team effort that's going to be required. Well, having said that, Paul, I can't thank you enough for coming back on the show and talking about all these interesting topics. Thanks again so much.
Thank you very much, Vic. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always.
Thanks again, and have a great night.
Right, I wish you well.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter and you'd like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, you can reach me at contact@dogmanencounters.com. I'd love to hear from you.